What kind of man lets a child beg him for help? And still hesitates. The rain had just started falling over South Side Chicago, thin drops tapping against the polished surface of a black Rolls-Royce Phantom worth nearly $500,000. The engine still humming low like it owned the street it stood on, and Daniel Kong stepped out without looking up, his shoes touching wet pavement that reflected the city lights in fractured gold. His presence alone enough to make conversations nearby lower into whispers, because men like him didn't walk into neighborhoods like this unless something already belonged to them, and yet before his driver could even close the door, something unexpected broke through that invisible wall around him. A small hand, trembling, cold, gripping his wrist with a strength that didn't match its size, and for the first time that night, Daniel stopped, not out of fear, but out of something far more unfamiliar, interruption. He looked down slowly, his expression unreadable, and there she was, a little girl, no older than 8, her sneakers soaked through, her jacket too thin for the cold, her breathing uneven like she had been running farther than someone her size ever should, and her eyes wide, shining, desperate, locked onto his like she had already made a decision that could not be undone. "They're killing my mom," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain, but it landed harder than anything else in that moment, and Daniel didn't respond right away, because the word she chose, killing, not hurting, not arguing, but killing, echoed differently in a world where words like that were often used too casually. His bodyguards moved instantly, stepping forward with controlled urgency, hands ready, voices low but firm. "Sir, step back, we'll handle this." But Daniel didn't move, not yet, because something about the way she held on, not begging, not crying loudly, but steady, like she believed he was the only person left who could change what was about to happen, cut through the layers he had built over years of power and control. He gently pulled his wrist free, not to reject her, but to look at her more clearly. "Where is your father?" he asked, his tone calm, almost detached, the kind of question that came from someone who believed every situation had a structure, a missing piece that could be identified and solved. But the girl shook her head immediately, her grip tightening again. "We don't need him," she said, and something in that answer didn't fit the story Daniel had already begun constructing in his mind, because to him, this looked like another broken home, another mistake, another problem that could be traced back to poor choices, and yet her eyes didn't carry shame, they carried urgency, clarity, something sharper than fear. Around them, people pretended not to see. A couple walked past a little faster. A man leaned against a wall and looked the other way, because in this part of the city, you learned early that getting involved could cost more than staying silent, and Daniel knew that rule better than anyone. He had built entire systems on that kind of silence, and still, he found himself standing there, in the rain, being held in place by a child who didn't belong in his world. And for reasons he couldn't explain yet, he didn't walk away. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not move closer than necessary. But the space itself seemed to adjust around him as if it still remembered who he was, even if the people inside it no longer responded the same way. "This ends now," he said, not as a threat, not as a command shouted into chaos, but as a statement that had always been enough before, and for a brief moment silence followed, the kind of silence that used to mean obedience. But Marcus did not step back. He did not release the tension in his posture. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, studying Daniel with a familiarity that had lost its respect. "You really think you still decide how things end?" Marcus said, and there was no anger in his voice, only something heavier, something closer to disappointment mixed with defiance, and Daniel felt that shift immediately, not as an insult, but as a fracture in a structure he had trusted for too long. Behind Marcus, Tasha straightened just enough to meet Daniel's gaze directly, and in that moment he saw something that did not fit the role he had already assigned to her. She was not asking for help, not in the way he expected. There was no silent plea, no reaching for rescue. Instead there was recognition, sharp and deliberate, as if she knew exactly who he was and what that meant. "You should not be here," she said, her voice steady despite everything around her, and Daniel paused, not because he was uncertain, but because her words did not carry fear, they carried warning, and that difference unsettled him more than anything. Marcus had said, "He is not the one you think he is anymore." Tasha continued, her eyes flicking briefly toward Marcus, then back to Daniel, and that was when Daniel realized something else. This was not a sudden confrontation. This was the result of something that had been building. something that involved choices he had made long before this night, choices that had continued to move even after he stopped watching them. Amara stepped forward slightly, her voice quiet but cutting through the tension with unexpected clarity. "You said people listen to you?" She reminded him, and Daniel felt that again, that subtle pressure, not from fear, but from expectation, as if the version of himself he had presented to the world was now being tested in a way he could not control. Marcus let out a breath, shaking his head slowly. "She told you something, did she not?" he said, his tone shifting, less confrontational, more knowing, and Daniel did not answer because the truth was no one had told him anything clearly. He had walked into this situation assuming he understood it, assuming it followed the same rules as everything else he had handled. But now those assumptions were unraveling piece by piece. Marcus took a small step back, not retreating but repositioning, creating space that felt less like surrender and more like a change in perspective. "You built something," Marcus said, gesturing vaguely, "not just to the alley but to something larger, something invisible but present. And you stopped looking at what it became." And Daniel's expression remained controlled, but internally something shifted again, because those words carried truth in a way that was difficult to dismiss. He had built systems, networks, structures designed to operate without constant oversight, and he had trusted that they would hold their shape, that they would follow the boundaries he had set. But standing here now, he was beginning to see the cracks, not as isolated failures, but as consequences. And Tasha spoke again, softer this time, but no less direct. "You think this is about him?" she said, nodding slightly toward Marcus. "But it is not." And Daniel looked at her, really looked this time, not as a variable in a situation, but as someone who understood more than she should. "Then what is it about?" he asked, and for the first time since he arrived, there was no certainty in the question, only a need to understand something that no longer fit into the categories he relied on. And Tasha held his gaze for a moment longer before answering. "It is about what your world does to people when you are not watching." And the alley fell into a deeper silence, not empty, but heavy, filled with a realization that had not yet fully formed but was already impossible to ignore. And beside him, Amara did not look away from him, not even for a second, because she was still waiting to see what kind of man he would choose to be next. Daniel Kong had spent years believing that distance created clarity, that stepping back from the details allowed him to see the bigger picture. But standing in that narrow alley, with rain still falling in quiet persistence, he realized how much had been moving without him, how much had grown in directions he never intended, and yet had never stopped. His gaze shifted briefly from Tasha to Marcus and then back again, recalculating, reassessing, not the situation itself, but his own understanding of it. "Explain," he said finally, his voice lower now, not commanding, but searching. And Tasha let out a slow breath, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment, not for permission, but for acknowledgement. "You think everything here is about control," she said, her words measured, careful. "About who owes what, who belongs where, who answers to you." And Daniel did not interrupt, because that framework was not wrong. It was how his world functioned, how it survived. "But you stopped seeing what happens after that," she continued, her eyes steady on his. And there was no accusation in her tone, only a statement that carried weight because it did not need to be raised. Marcus shifted slightly to the side, no longer the center of attention, almost as if he understood that this conversation had moved beyond him, and that alone told Daniel more than anything else. This was not about a single man crossing a line. This was about a system that had changed shape. Amara stepped closer again, not touching Daniel this time, but close enough that he could feel her presence at his side, grounding, watching, waiting. And Daniel became aware of something he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time: uncertainty. Not the kind that came from fear, but the kind that came from realizing that the rules he relied on were incomplete. "You said she owes me?" Daniel said, turning his attention back to Marcus, his tone sharpening slightly. "What does that mean?" And Marcus met his gaze without hesitation, but also without the deference that used to be there. "It means your world reached her before you did," he said, and Daniel felt that again, that subtle shift, because the words were not defensive, they were factual. "She took money," Marcus added, "but not in the way you think." And Daniel's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in focus, because this was the part where truth usually revealed itself in fragments, in contradictions, and he had built his entire life on putting those pieces together faster than anyone else. But tonight, he was behind. Tasha spoke again before Marcus could continue. "I did not take it to disappear," she said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her body. "I took it because there was no other way." And Daniel watched her closely now, not as a problem to solve, but as a person whose choices were connected to his own in ways he had not considered. "No other way for what?" he asked, and this time, there was no distance in his voice, only a need to understand the part of the story he had missed. Tasha hesitated for the first time, not out of fear, but because the answer carried something heavier than the rest, something that could not be explained without changing how he saw everything. And beside him, Amara's voice came again, softer than before but stronger in its certainty. "She did it for me?" she said, and Daniel turned slightly, looking down at her, really looking now, noticing details he had overlooked, the way she held herself, the way she watched everything without reacting too quickly, the way her words were chosen, not rushed, and something inside him shifted again, because this was not just a child caught in someone else's mistakes. This was someone who understood more than she should have had to. Marcus exhaled slowly, almost like relief, as if the truth no longer needed to be held back. "Hospital bills," he said quietly. "Tens of millions of one and growing." And Daniel's mind processed that instantly, converting it, calculating it, recognizing the scale, not just as numbers, but as pressure, as desperation, as the kind of situation that pushed people into choices they would never otherwise make. And for the first time since this began, Daniel did not respond immediately because the problem in front of him was no longer external. It was connected to something deeper, something he had built, something he had trusted, and now something he could no longer ignore. Daniel Kong had faced numbers like that before, numbers that looked large to others but were simply variables to him, costs to be absorbed, risks to be calculated, but hearing it now, tied not to a business deal or a negotiation, but to a child standing beside him in the rain, changed the weight of it in a way he had not expected. Tens of millions of one, a figure that could be moved with a single decision in his world, yet here it had stretched into something that reshaped lives, decisions, consequences. And Daniel remained still, his expression controlled, but his silence no longer carried authority, it carried recognition, because this was not just about money, it was about the path that money had taken. "You could have asked," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now, less certain than before, and Tasha let out a faint breath, something close to disbelief, not dramatic, not loud, but enough to shift the air between them. "Asked who?" she replied, and Daniel did not answer immediately because the truth was, in his world, asking was not a simple act. It came with visibility, with exposure, with consequences that people like her would not survive, and he knew that. Even if he had never said it out loud, Marcus shook his head slightly, almost as if he had been waiting for that exact response. "You still think people can reach you?" he said, and there was no accusation in his tone, only a statement that landed harder because it was calm. "They do not even know where to begin." And Daniel felt something shift again, not externally but internally, because the distance he had built, the layers of protection, the structure that ensured his power remained intact, had also created something else, something he had not accounted for, a barrier that did not just keep threats out, but kept reality away. Amara looked up at him again, her eyes steady, not pleading, not afraid, but searching, as if she was measuring him against something she already understood. "She tried," the girl said quietly, and Daniel turned slightly toward her, listening in a way he had not at the beginning. "She went to people who said they worked for you?" Amara continued, her voice even, each word placed carefully. "They told her to wait, then they told her to pay more, then they told her it was not enough." And Daniel's gaze hardened slightly, not in anger, but in clarity, because that was not how his system was supposed to function. It was not designed to trap people like that. It was designed to move efficiently, to maintain order, to ensure that transactions were controlled and predictable. But now, hearing it through the voice of a child, the structure sounded different, distorted, like something that had been altered without his awareness. "Who did you speak to?" Daniel asked, his tone sharper now, not directed at Tasha as a challenge, but as a need to identify where the break had occurred. And Tasha hesitated, not because she was hiding something, but because the answer itself was complicated, layered in ways that could not be simplified easily. "Names do not matter," she said finally, her voice steady again, "because they all said the same thing, And Daniel understood what she meant before she finished, because systems like his did not fail in isolation. They shifted gradually, one decision at a time, one unchecked action leading to another, until the original intent no longer matched the outcome. Marcus crossed his arms loosely, no longer defensive, no longer aggressive, but observing, almost as if he had stepped out of the conflict and into the role of witness. "You gave people power," Marcus said, "and you stopped watching what they did with it." And Daniel did not respond immediately, because there was no quick answer to that, no simple correction that could undo what had already happened. And for the first time since he stepped out of that car, he felt something he had not allowed himself to feel in years. Not fear, not doubt, but responsibility, not as a concept, but as something tangible, something standing in front of him in the form of a woman who had made a choice he did not fully understand yet, and a child who had carried that consequence to his doorstep. And in that moment, Daniel realized that this situation was no longer something he could solve by stepping in and imposing order. It required something else, something he had not practiced in a long time. And as the rain continued to fall, soft but steady, he looked at Tasha again, not as a problem, not as a variable, but as someone whose story had intersected with his in a way that could no longer be ignored. And for the first time, he asked a question without assuming he already knew the answer. "What exactly did you take?" he said, and this time he waited. Daniel did not shift his stance, but something in the way he stood changed, less rigid, less certain of the ground beneath him, as if the question he had just asked carried more weight than he intended. And Tasha watched him closely, measuring whether this was another test or something real, because in her world, men like him did not ask questions they did not already have answers to, and yet here he was, waiting, and that waiting said more than any command ever could. "Not money," she said. Finally, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that still clung to her, and Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recalibration, because that answer disrupted the structure he had already begun rebuilding in his mind. "Then what?" he asked, and this time there was no edge in his tone, only focus. Tasha reached slowly into the inside pocket of her worn jacket, her movements deliberate, not cautious, but controlled. And for a brief second, Daniel's bodyguards shifted behind him, reacting on instinct, but Daniel lifted his hand just enough to stop them. His attention fixed entirely on her, and when she pulled her hand back out, it was not holding anything valuable in the way his world defined value. No cash, no device, no weapon, just a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, creased from being opened too many times, and she held it out toward him, not offering it like a plea, but presenting it like evidence. Daniel took it without hesitation, his fingers brushing the damp surface as he unfolded it, his eyes scanning quickly at first, then slowing as the meaning settled in. It was not a receipt in the traditional sense, not a bill he could immediately process and resolve. It was a document stamped, signed, filled with medical terminology and numbers that translated into something far more complex than a simple transaction. A treatment plan, long-term, ongoing, with costs broken down in units that converted easily in his mind. Tens of millions. Of one, increasing over time, each line representing not just expense, but necessity, and Daniel felt something unfamiliar then. Not confusion, but displacement, because this was not a problem that fit into his usual categories. This was not about profit or loss, not about leverage or negotiation. This was about time, about survival measured not in power, but in days, in access, in whether someone could continue or not. "She needs this," Amara said quietly beside him, not pointing at the paper, not explaining it because she did not need to. Her voice alone carried enough certainty to make the numbers real in a way they had never been before. Daniel folded the paper slowly, more carefully than he had, unfolded it and handed it back to Tasha, his movements controlled but deliberate. "You took this from one of my accounts," he said, not accusing, not questioning, but confirming, and Tasha nodded once, her eyes never leaving his. "From a place that would not notice?" she said, and Daniel understood what she meant immediately. Accounts designed to move quietly, to absorb discrepancies without drawing attention, systems built for flexibility that had now been used in a way he had not anticipated. Marcus let out a quiet breath, almost like agreement. "You taught people where the gaps were," he said, and Daniel did not deny it because that was true. He had built those gaps intentionally as part of a larger design, but he had never considered how they could be used outside of his control. Amara shifted slightly, her gaze still fixed on him, and there was something in her expression that made Daniel pause, Not because she was afraid, but because she was watching him decide, not just what to do next, but who he was in this moment, and Daniel realized that this was the point where everything could return to what it had been. He could close the gap, correct the system, restore order, and walk away with control intact, or he could acknowledge what stood in front of him and accept that the system itself needed to change. And for the first time in a long time, that second option did not feel like weakness. It felt like something else entirely, something heavier, something more difficult to carry. And as the rain continued to fall around them, quiet and steady, Daniel Kong made no immediate move, because the decision he was about to make could not be undone. And he knew that once he chose, nothing would return to the way it was before. Daniel Kong had built his entire life on decisive action, on the ability to move faster than doubt, to close gaps before they widened, to correct deviations before they became threats. But now he stood in the middle of a narrow alley with rain tracing quiet lines down his coat, holding nothing in his hands and yet carrying something far heavier than any decision he had made in years, because this was not about restoring control. It was about confronting what his control had become. His gaze shifted once more between Tasha and Amara, and then briefly to Marcus, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a clarity that had been missing when he first arrived. "You should have come to me," he said again, but this time the words carried no authority, only the recognition that they no longer meant what they once did. And Tasha shook her head slightly, not dismissive, not defiant, but certain. "You were never there," she replied. And Daniel did not argue, because the truth in that statement was no longer something he could deny. The systems he built had replaced his presence. The layers of people and processes had turned access into distance, and distance into silence. And in that silence, decisions had been made without him. Lives had been shaped without his awareness, and consequences had formed that he was only now beginning to see. Amara stepped closer, her voice soft but steady. "You said you would help," she reminded him, and Daniel looked down at her, not as a stranger now, not as a disruption, but as the reason this moment existed at all. And he understood something then, something simple but undeniable. She had not chosen him because he was powerful. She had chosen him because she believed he would act. And that belief, fragile but firm, carried more weight than any expectation he had faced before. Daniel turned slightly, his posture shifting in a way that his bodyguards recognized instantly, not as aggression, but as decision, and though he did not raise his voice, the change in his presence was enough to alter the atmosphere around them. "This does not continue," he said, his tone calm, but grounded in something deeper than control, and Marcus watched him closely, searching for the version of Daniel he used to know, the one who would resolve this quickly, efficiently, without hesitation. But what he saw instead was something unfamiliar, something slower, more deliberate. "You think saying that changes anything?" Marcus replied, not mocking, not hostile, but genuinely uncertain, and Daniel met his gaze without shifting. "No," he said, "but what I do next will." And for a moment the alley seemed to hold its breath, not because of fear, but because something fundamental was about to change. Daniel reached into his coat, not for anything threatening, but for his phone, a simple object in a world that often relied on far more complex tools, and he paused for just a second before using it, not because he did not know what to do, but because he understood the weight of the action. This was not a call to enforce control. This was a call that would expose what had been hidden, that would pull his system into the light in a way it had never been before. And when he finally dialed, his voice was steady, precise. "Get me everything on the accounts tied to Southside operations, every name, every transaction, every report, now," he said, and there was no hesitation on the other end, because even now, his authority still held, but what he intended to do with it had shifted. He ended the call and lowered the phone, his gaze returning to Tasha. "If this started with me," he said, quietly, "then it ends with me too." And there was no dramatic movement, no immediate resolution, just a stillness that felt heavier than action, because for the first time, Daniel Kong was not just stepping into a situation to control it, he was stepping into it to change it, and beside him, Amara did not smile, did not relax, she simply watched him, because she was not waiting for promises, she was waiting to see if he would become the man she believed he could be. The rain did not stop, but something else did, the quiet illusion that Daniel Kong still understood everything that moved under his name, because as he lowered his phone, the weight of what he had just set in motion began to settle in a way he could not ignore, not as pressure from outside, but as a realization forming from within. His system was no longer something he controlled. It was something he was about to confront, and that difference changed everything. Marcus watched him carefully, not with hostility anymore, but with a kind of distance that suggested he had already accepted how this would unfold. "You think pulling records changes what already happened?" Marcus said, his voice steady, and Daniel did not respond. Immediately, because he knew Marcus was right in one way, information did not undo consequences, it only revealed them, and sometimes that was more dangerous than not knowing at all. Tasha shifted slightly, her strength returning not physically, but in the way she held herself, because something in Daniel's response had altered the balance of the situation, not enough to resolve it, but enough to open a space that had not existed before, and Amara stood between them, not as a shield, not as someone caught in the middle, but as the point where all of this connected, her eyes moving from one face to another, watching not for what was said, but for what changed, and Daniel felt that again, that quiet pressure, not from fear, not from expectation, but from being seen in a way he was not used to, because she was not looking at his power, she was looking at his choices, and that was something far more difficult to control. A faint vibration in his hand broke the stillness. His phone, the screen lighting up with a response faster than anyone outside his world would expect. The system was already answering, already moving, because that was what it had been designed to do. But now, the information it carried was no longer a tool, it was a mirror. Daniel glanced down, his eyes scanning quickly, and for the first time that night, something in his expression changed, not visibly enough for most people to notice, but enough that Amara did, because she stepped slightly closer, not asking, just watching. The names on the screen were familiar, too familiar, layers of operations, accounts, intermediaries, all connected in ways that were efficient, invisible, and now unmistakably flawed. Transactions flagged not for irregularity, but for frequency, patterns that showed repetition, escalation, pressure applied over time, not by one person but by many, all acting within a structure that had allowed it. And Daniel understood then that this was not an isolated failure, it was systemic, a pattern that had gone unnoticed because it had been designed to avoid attention. And Tasha spoke again, her voice quieter now, not because she was weak, but because the truth no longer needed to be forced. "It was never just him," she said, nodding slightly toward Marcus, and Daniel did not look up from the screen immediately because what he was seeing confirmed that, line by line, entry by entry, the system had adapted, but not in the way he intended. It had learned how to extract, how to pressure, how to continue without interruption, and the people inside it had followed that logic without question, because that was what systems did. They continued, regardless of who they affected. Daniel locked the phone and lowered it slowly, the glow disappearing, but the information remaining heavier now, because it could not be unseen. Marcus let out a quiet breath, almost like relief. "Now you see it?" he said, not as a challenge, but as a statement, and Daniel met his gaze again, not as a superior, not as someone above the situation, but as someone inside it, and for the first time since this began, there was no distance left between them. Not in understanding, not in responsibility. "Yes," Daniel said, his voice calm, but carrying something new, something grounded not in control, but in acceptance, and that single word changed the space more than any command could have, because it was not about power anymore, it was about truth, and beside him, Amara did not look away, because she knew that this was not the end of anything, it was the moment everything became real.